This is my first video in a new series I'm doing, which follows the book, How Magnus Carlsen Became the Youngest Grandmaster in the World. Now, this book documents Magnus Carlsen's meteoric rise from a 9-year-old boy to the best chess player to ever live. This book is very important because not only does it document Magnus Carlsen's rise to the top, but the games in the book along the way show Magnus Carlsen beating very good tournament players, but not elite grandmasters. So it's very instructional, these games, but at the same time, they're not over our heads, especially since you have your pal here analyzing every move for you. Anyway, this first game is Magnus Carlsen as a 10-year-old boy playing in a Norwegian championship, or Norwegian tournament rather, against a 2280 rated player. Let's dive in and see how Magnus played it. All right, this game took place in Norway at the Bergen International Tournament in 2001. Magnus Carlsen had the black pieces, and we get a Queen's Gambit decline position. Both players playing it well. It's all theory right here. And white plays 95 here. 95 is a good centrally placed knight. The problem is the knight can't stay there. It can easily be dislodged. But now Magnus would like to dislodge it right away and challenge it. Maybe something like if you play knight d7. The problem with that move is we have knight c6 forking the bishop and queen, and you don't lose the bishop outright. You don't lose a piece, but you lose the bishop pair. On an open board like this, white has an advantage. The dark squares are going to weaken, and you don't want to do that. And also, you can't play knight c6 because then Magnus Carlsen would never be Magnus Carlsen if he played stuff like that. So he didn't play that. Magnus Carlsen, however, played a really good move here. He played bishop a6, and this is to get rid of white's powerful bishop. This bishop's very powerful. It's forming a battery at the king. So why would you want this bishop to stay there if you don't have to? You don't. The knight's protecting a6, so white castles. Magnus trades the bishops and now brings his queen to c7. Now the knight can come here and challenge the knight on c6, and then he can get rid of the knight. Okay, white plays f4 because he knows that Magnus is going to challenge the knight and chop it off. So he's like, when you do, I'm going to take back with these pawns and have a strong center. Magnus isn't going to go for that, and this move is actually too hopeful, and it just weakens his position. So Magnus plays knight c6, and now we have rook f3. Now this is two aggressive moves. f4 followed by rook f3. Rook f3 is a rook lift, so in other words, the rook's going to come lateral, and typically that's what happens in rook lifts, and attack the kingside. However, there's really no kingside attack going on here. There's nothing, and this dark square bishop can't really come in on the attack and join in because it's all clogged up, and there's really no attack here, so it's just a pipe dream. Magnus takes and plays in the center, concentrates in the center of the board. He's 10 years old here. Now, white has to play knight c6 and get rid of his good knight without getting the pawn here in that bind I was telling you about. Now, why did white have to do that? So this is genius by Magnus Carlsen. He's by playing in the center, by playing what's most important, he's actually getting everything he wants. If white just simply takes back, normally, then Magnus plays knight takes d4. And you can't take back because, oh, hello, the bishop. Another reason why f4 was a weakening move, it opened the king up to pins and attacks like that. So for that reason, white had to throw in this in-between move before he takes on d4, and now he takes on d4. So white's a strong player. He's 2280. He's almost 2300. And I'm assuming he's an adult because there's not really many children out there. I was 2300. And he managed to not drop material, but Magnus has a better position. And Magnus just calmly develops his rook here. And now we have f5. Now f5 looks like an attacking move. It is taking more space in case Magnus ever plays g6. He can take, but I think it's just moving his bishop into position. He wants his bishop on f4 and possibly g5 in some variations. So he's just clearing his way for the bishop. But Magnus now utilizes the fact that he has control over the center and plays knight e4. This is a great move. Now, you might be wondering why white can't just take and chop off the knight. Well, Magnus would take back with the fork. Now, if you're pretty good at chess, you might be wondering, well, what if white throws in that sneaky move and attacks the queen? And if you take the queen, they take the queen. Well, then we'll just throw in this move. Now, if you're even more savvy than that, you might have saw, well, then we have bishop e3. Attacking the queen, blocking the check, attacking the queen, but we would simply take the queen here. And after our opponent takes back, we take back with the bishop check, after the king moves somewhere, and now we can just protect the pawn. No big deal. And we're up a piece, totally, completely winning. So for that reason, you can't take the knight on e4. So anyway, instead we have bishop f4. Now after bishop f4, we have bishop f6. Notice how Magnus is not letting his opponent anchor his bishop in here. He's fighting for control of the center, and not to mention putting pressure on that weak isolated pawn. Now the opponent goes for knight b5. I'm only laughing because he doesn't realize he's playing Magnus Carlsen, or who Magnus Carlsen would soon, come to be. He's just attacking a simple fork here, and Magnus is like, no, you're not going to do that. He moves his rook that's already developed to stop it. Now, why did he move the rook that's already developed to stop that threat? Well, if he moves this one, he loses control over a7. White wins a pawn and is going to win the exchange. After you move your queen, he's going to take the rook. Now White's winning the game. So Magnus sees that and moves the other rook. We have rook c1. Magnus calmly sidesteps it and protects the pawn again. That rook was a waste of move before. Rook f3 because he came back to f1. Magnus takes back, and he takes back with the bishop. He also could have taken back with the rook if he wanted to. Now we have rook c8, and we have bishop e3. Magnus kicks out the knight, and here is a decisive mistake here. Now, why would you put your knight back here? Because there's very few squares to get back into the game. Now, if you had the c4 square, I could see putting the knight here, because then you can come to c4 and then e4. But he can't. So he should have came back to c3, and then after takes, he probably didn't like that because he has a backwards pawn, and black is better here, but still that was his best way to go. So anyway, after this, Magnus just enters the position and starts piling on the pressure here. His opponent didn't like that. He didn't want his queen in there, so he offered a trade of queens and attacking the pawn. Magnus obliges and says, okay, I'm going to double isolate your pawns. Now you have a weakness I can focus in on. I have a great knight. My rook is controlling this file. Everything's good. So, what to complain about. Now, knight d6. Why knight d6? It's not necessary. He didn't have to play that move, but it just gives his knight flexibility. His knight, if the pawn ever moves, he can come here. He's putting pressure on this pawn. So if the rook ever tries to combat this file, this pawn will drop. And not to mention, the knight can always come back here if it wants to. There's no piece in White's camp that's stopping the knight from coming back there. So it's like a flexible move / waiting move on Magnus's part. Okay, so his opponent sees that and plays g4. So now his rook is not babysitting this pawn anymore. We don't want our big pieces to babysit our small pieces. So now his rook can go out on adventures. However, he's a 2300 rated player, almost. But anyway, his defensive moves are also going to pack some venom with it. He wanted to also play g5, which kicks the bishop out of here, takes space, and he can go for some type of attack, maybe bust open the king side, or just get the bishop out of position. Magnus sees this and plays h6, stops it, and now we have king f2. King f2 is not a nice, good, a well-placed king, but I understand why he played it, because we're approaching the end game, so he wants his king to be ready to get into the action, because in the end game, we want our king to be active in the center. So for that reason, it's a good idea. It just doesn't work because of Magnus's next move, b5. Now, b5 is a great move. Now, it's preparing simply just to invade the rook into c2, because the knight is defending it, and he's going to kick out the knight, and then when the knight moves, he's going to just simply go into c2. Now, you might be saying, well, what happens if he comes here? Well, Magnus is just going to play this anyway, and then b4, and after the knight moves, Magnus is going to come in here anyway, take the pawn. This pawn's going to drop, and this pawn's passed. It's just not a good position to be in. This knight's coming in here. This is pretty awful. So after this, his opponent played rook a1. The idea is he wanted to get this pawn. However, I'm going to show you why that doesn't work. Magnus has the initiative. So Magnus just pushes the pawn, knocks the knight back, and plays rook c2 check. The king, notice how the king's moving up and not to the corner. That's because we're getting close to an endgame. So the king is actually, in theory, it's better placed in the middle of the board where it's active. In this case, it didn't really work out for him, and also if he comes back, this rook will stop him from ever coming back into the game. So I completely understand king f3 here. Magnus just takes the pawn. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't he take the rook? And some of you are saying, oh, because he would lose his knight. And then some of you are saying, yeah, but then you can take this knight. And now, what do we do here? So after this variation, after rook takes knight, it's not because he can take the knight. That's not what would happen. What would happen here is if he takes on a3, Magnus would not take the knight. Magnus would simply just play knight e4. And that's why you can't go into this variation. Now, why can't you do this? Why is this so devastating? The only square that the knight can get to is now covered twice, so the knight's trapped. The only move that protects the knight is this pitiful rook a1 move. Now the rook is stuck in the corner. Now you can take this pawn. This pawn's pinned, it can drop. This is a pretty sad game for white. So for that reason, he played knight d2 instead, and then we have knight b5. Now he takes the rook, but now Magnus gets this pawn and this pawn, and now Magnus just gets his king out of the way, gets his king out of all the checks, just in case. And after h4, Magnus plays d4. After the bishop moves, he attacks the rook, but uses this attack just as a pivot square, as a tempo, to get his knight to e4 where he really wants to go. The rook comes to the 7th rank. Magnus throws in the check and then plays rook f2. And after we have g5, so his opponent says, you're attacking me, I'm attacking you. But Magnus says, not really. This is where Magnus's calculation comes into play. And he really had great calculation even as a kid because he throws in the check. Now, after this, you might be saying, well, after the rook moves, which is what happened, well, now you can take the bishop. But you can't because we have knight takes, and now the king comes back up here. We just come back to this original square check. The only square that protects the bishop is g4, and then we have h5, forcing the king away from the bishop. We're up a piece. We have two passed pawns, and that's resignable. That's definitely resignable. So what happens is after rook f1, you can't take the bishop. So white just simply played rook f7. He didn't know what to play. Magnus took here, and his opponent resigned. Why does opponent resign? Well, if he takes back, he can just simply take back with the knight. If he takes back with the bishop, he's not getting a piece back because we have check. After the king moves, we just throw in this check. And if you can also take with the rook, I know what you're saying, this doesn't work because you just take back and defend the rook. And there you have it, folks. That's vintage Magnus Carlsen as a 10-year-old beating a 2200 level player. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any further content. And also check out this video, very instructive. Now get out of here, go play some chess.